Hello, everybody, and welcome to another session on the Global ABC Roadmaps for Buildings and Construction for Latin America. We still have a few people who are signing on, so we'll just give them a few more minutes, and then we'll make a start. Thanks for your patience. Hello, everybody. And we have a few more people on the line now. Welcome, everybody, to another session on the Global ABC Roadmaps for Buildings and Construction in Latin America. My name is Maxine Jordan from the IEA, and we're very glad to be here today to share with you the latest version of the Latin America Roadmap for Buildings and Construction. So this work is the result of several months of various activities in which we've been involving and speaking to hundreds of people. So it's really the result of a collective effort from building players all across Latin America. And for that, we'd like to thank you once again. And thank you for being here today to continue the conversation. So this webinar today is for us to show you what we've done with these conversations, the information that we collected through workshops and surveys, so that you can see what we've done and provide some feedback. So I'll quickly run through the agenda for our discussion. So after a quick welcome and introduction to the background on the project by Ju from the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction, we'll go through a quick reminder of all of the activities that have taken place in Latin America over the course of 2019. That have enabled to fill in this roadmap, and we'll present a snapshot of some of the key findings. So as you know, the full document is accessible via the link that you will have received with the webinar invitation, and we really do invite you to have a look at the full document in your own time and provide some comments and feedback as today we'll only have time to go through 2 of the 8 sections in the interest of time. So we'll also have a discussion session, and then we'll also have some questions for you. So we've prepared a couple of questions, some questions to pick your brains as to some gaps that we still have, and also some questions about what might be the next steps for these regional roadmaps. And for this moderated discussion, we'll be using a platform called Mentimeter. So this will require the use of a browser, and this can be either through a smartphone or a computer or a tablet. So just to warn you that we'll be needing that to have the full experience. So I'll send you the links when we get to that point. But just to give you a warning. And at any point during the webinar, please feel free to use the chat box to post any questions or comments, and we can get to them during the discussion. And if you would like to say something, you can raise your hand and we can moderate that when we get to the discussion. So I'd like to hand over now to Ju from the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction, who's going to tell us a little bit more about the Global ABC and the background to this project.
Hello, thank you, Maxine. Welcome everyone, thanks for joining today. My name is Ju and I work with Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction, which we also call it Global ABC. And I wanted to kick off with a little introduction to the Global ABC to give you some context and as well as background to the regional roadmap development process. For those of you who are not familiar with our work, the Global ABC was founded at COP21 and is hosted by the and its secretariat actually is hosted by the United Nations Environment Program. We are an international initiative with a focus on, as you can see, raising ambitions in the building sector to meet the Paris climate goals, as well as mobilizing all actors along this fragmented value chain. We currently count with 128 members, including 29 countries, together with members in the private sector, as well as international organizations, civil society, among other key building stakeholders. Our motto is working towards zero emission, efficient, and resilient buildings and construction sector. And that's done through giving a voice to the building sector regarding its impact and potential. Also through collaboration, mainly partnerships and technology and know-how sharing. And finally, through finding solutions and pathways that put the sector on a well below 2 degrees path. In the next slide, we'll see some of our key activities. Waiting for that to pop. Yes. So in the first box, we have some of our knowledge products, which includes the NDC guide and the global and regional roadmaps themselves. Yeah, which we will talk in more depth today. But aside from that, we also facilitate knowledge exchange and collaboration among key building stakeholders through the organization of regional roundtables, as well as the promotion of national alliances. We also keep the buildings and construction sector under review through our global status report, which some of you may already know about. The 2019 edition is available for download in our website, so I invite you to go and check if you haven't done so. And lastly, we also help shape the global agenda, mainly raising the profile of the importance of the building sector in climate action. And that's done in high level forums, like the event, like the ones that you can see in the screen. The next slide, please. Yes, yeah, so as mentioned in the previously, one of the Global ABC products is the Global Roadmap, which was developed in 2016 in its first version. And it painted a picture of the main overarching goals and agenda for the building sector. And recently, in an effort to narrow the scope of the global roadmap, the Global ABC, together with the IEA, started the development of 3 regional roadmaps, one in Africa, one in Asia, and one in Latin America. And as Maxine said in the beginning, this has been a stakeholder-driven process, highly iterative, with a lot of experts who are joining us today as well, who have engaged and contributed in shaping the document to its current version. So this document, the Latin America Roadmap, sets out timelines for the building sectors, looking from now to the 2050, and it lays out some of the key actions that needed to be taken in order to decarbonize the sector in a timely manner. As some of you may know, it is also centered around 8 key activity areas: urban planning, new buildings, retrofits, operation systems, materials, resilience, and clean energy. And through this regional roadmap development process, we were able to come to various findings, very interesting findings, and also identify some important data and ambition gaps in which we will focus in today's discussion. And next slide, please. Yep. So yeah, we're glad to be here today to learn from you, to ask you questions. We have time dedicated in the end for our moderated discussion and questions. So I hope you are interested in learning more about the work of the Global ABC. Please feel free to reach out to us through the contact details in the screen, and also follow us in social media. And once again, just a big thank you to everyone who's been engaged in this process, and to those who are joining us for the first time now, welcome, and we hope to continue working with you. And over to you, Maxine.
Thank you, Ju, for that introduction. So as Ju mentioned, the Latin America Roadmap is really a project that's been built by actors in the building sector in Latin America to look at 2050 and set out aspirations for reaching zero emission, efficient and resilient buildings and construction. And this exercise really aims at breaking down these long-term aspirations into key actions and targets for the short, medium and long term. And really getting down to real actions that can be taken now by cities, countries, or regions to advance towards these goals. These roadmaps were built out of consultation with local building actors, and we reached out to them through the networks of our partners. So I just wanted to mention them briefly now. So we have the World Green Building Council and its network of national green building councils who are at the forefront of green building in their countries, and also the World Resources Institute with its wide network of stakeholders and through implementation projects on the ground. Without forgetting, of course, Global ABC's members and partners, and the IEA's Energy Efficiency in Emerging Economies network. So we thank all of members of these networks and our partners for all the work so far. And I'd also like to quickly introduce Ian Hamilton from the UCL Energy Institute, who has also been a key partner in the development of these roadmaps. And you'll be hearing a bit more from him later. He'll be helping to moderate the discussion session. So once again, thank you to everybody who has been involved so far and for all of you here today. So I'm going to start with a quick overview of the document structure. So those familiar with the document will be familiar with the structure, but just to summarize, we have at the front, we have summary timelines and key actions. So these are 2 pages summarizing the different actions that we propose under each of the 8 different themes. Then we have a regional overview of what is going on in the region, macroeconomic effects, energy trends that help set the context for the timelines and activities to come. And then we have our 8 activities, which Ju mentioned. So we have urban planning, new buildings, existing buildings, retrofits, operations, systems, materials and resilience, and clean energy to really capture the whole of the buildings and construction sector. And for each of these activities, we have regional trends, so what is going on within that activity in the region. We have key actions, so that's a summary of the main things that can be done and aimed for now. We have a stakeholder mapping identifying who are the main actors in that area. And then we have our timelines. So we have timelines for policy and technology, which highlight the priority policies and technologies to reach the long-term goals within that activity. And these are followed by each time regional examples showing what is, illustrating these policy timelines and showing what's actually happening on the ground already in the region. And then we have short sections on finance, capacity building, and multiple benefits, which really highlight some specific actions that can be taken to enable the actions within that theme. And then we have a final chapter on enablers. So this is on capacity building, finance, and stakeholders again, this time looking at how to work with these cross-cutting themes to really enable all of this transformation to happen. So this is a list of all of the events that took place in Latin America over the course of 2018 and 2019. These include webinars, workshops, training events, and an online survey, which shows, so we see diversity of where we have been having opportunities to speak to people in person or over teleconference and through surveys. So this is how we filled the template that I showed you just now. This is how we filled our roadmap. So if I go now to summary of the findings, so we have here a couple of figures that come from the World Energy Outlook from 2019. That's an IEA publication. And we see that today's buildings account for 24% of final energy consumption and 21% of energy-related CO2 emissions in Central and South America. Just highlight that Mexico is not included here just because of the way the regions are set up. Mexico is part of North America, so that's why we have some figures just for Central and South America. And then we have results from the IEA Sustainable Development Scenario, showing us that there are over 120 megatons of CO2 emission savings possible by 2040. And this scenario is a scenario that meets the Sustainable Development Goals in full, and it meets the Paris Agreement, and therefore shows us what the energy system would look like in such a scenario. So we see that huge savings possible in indirect emissions in Latin America in buildings alone. So if we look at what that means from an energy system perspective, we could compare the energy consumption in buildings in 2018, which is already dominated by electricity at 43%, and this is expected to grow by 2040. And the main most significant trend in energy consumption within the building is a reduction in the use of traditional biomass for cooking and heating. So we see that thanks to energy efficiency, the final consumption of energy in buildings could increase by only 7 megatons of oil equivalent in 2040, but this is while serving an additional 50% of floor area, increased population, and continued increase in levels of ownership and use of electrical appliances. And if we look at what the electricity grid would have to look like to provide the savings seen in the Sustainable Development Scenario, we see that hydro continues to grow and is the dominant source of electricity generation, followed by wind and natural gas. And by 2040, we see a grid that is almost 90% renewable. So that's how it's achieving these energy savings, these emission savings that we saw previously. So this is just to give a bit of context to what are the sorts of shifts that are going to be needed to get to zero emission buildings and construction, if we're talking about operational energy and carbon as well as embodied energy and carbon. These are we have to look at the electricity grid and energy, the energy context of the region. So this figure summarizes the timeline. So this is part of the upfront summary of the document. So as we won't be able to go through every single theme today, here's just a snapshot of the summary of the types of actions that are prioritized within the different areas, and the cross-cutting enabling themes, including finance, capacity building, multiple benefits. Some of the common findings across the themes that we found was firstly a lack of integration and coordination across disciplines. This is something that particularly is relevant to urban planning, resilience, materials, and new buildings kinds of policies, because they are so cross-cutting across different disciplines and themes that there is still limited integration and coordination. There is still a lack of mandatory regulatory policies. So these types of policies are building codes, minimum energy performance standards, labeling. While there are quite a few voluntary codes, there is still limited use of mandatory codes that apply to all parts of the sector or all parts of all appliances. And then another theme was a lack of data surrounding the baseline for each of these different areas. Therefore, data collection and monitoring and analysis will be crucial. So diving into new buildings, which is one of the two themes that we'll go through today. As mentioned, we start each of the activities with a summary of the trends and challenges in Latin America to give us a bit of context of what is already happening at the moment and what the outlook is. So in Latin America and the Caribbean, for example, we see an expected floor growth area of 65% by 2050, and that's mostly residential buildings, or 11 billion meters squared of residential buildings. Increasing incomes are driving up floor area and appliance ownership and use per capita. And in terms of policy, we see that some countries have codes that are mandatory or voluntary for part of the sector, but many are in the process of still developing their first building code, and very few have mandatory codes for the whole sector. Another challenge is the share of the informal sector in Latin America. We have a statistic here that the informal sector is responsible for up to 70% of construction of new housing. So this represents a challenge. How to ensure compliance with building codes with such a large informal sector is something that we'd be very keen to discuss with you when we have the chance to open up the floor. So the key actions, the main key actions from this activity of new buildings include developing national strategies to decarbonize new and existing buildings. So developing locally appropriate strategies using an efficiency first approach, and including a strategy for decarbonizing the construction materials and operational energy all aiming to reach zero operational carbon buildings by 2030. And then developing, implementing, and progressively strengthening building energy codes that should be mandatory for all buildings to set minimal levels of efficiency and performance. But all the while ensuring adequate capacity and tools are in place to enable compliance across the building sector. Also reducing embodied and operational carbon through materials and clean energy measures. These are things that can be integrated into building codes or other buildings policies. And also increasing awareness and information around the benefits of more sustainable buildings to enable consumers to make better choices and enable more advantageous financing. The stakeholders, this table down here is a mapping of the stakeholders related to new buildings, and the ones with the darker green are the ones which would have more impact or a more central role in undertaking in delivering on these policies. So that's mostly subnational government, property and project developers, architects and engineers, manufacturers and suppliers, laborers and installers. These timelines here are a direct extract of the policy timelines for new buildings in the roadmap document, where the policies that are identified as priority each have a timeline with proposed targets for the short, medium, and long term. And as described at the top of the table, the target in bold in each of the sections of the timeline is the proposed target for the region, and the one below it is an aspirational target. And this aspirational target is to be aimed at by countries or jurisdictions within the region who are able to go further than the base target because of starting from a different point. So looking at the first policy, which is building energy codes, we saw that so the boxes on the right-hand side, they describe the what we call the consensus, and this is the consensus between the people that we spoke to or received information from through the surveys, what they thought the market would be able to deliver. So it's a difference between what the stakeholders thought and what needs to happen to be in line with sustainable development goals and sustainable development scenario. So in this case of building codes, there was a strong consensus that requirements for net zero buildings should be on a voluntary basis from 2030 and could be mandatory for all new buildings by 2050. And just as a clarification on the definitions, there was consensus around starting using the terms of near zero energy and then net zero energy by 2040 and net zero carbon by 2050. However, we do know that having a building code is not enough. So the next challenge is really implementing it and ensuring compliance, which is why compliance with building codes is the second item here. So while the targets are to achieve compliance with building codes for all buildings by 2050, there was a consensus that this would be challenging, with only about half or most new buildings reaching compliance by 2050. So this was highlighted as an ambition gap or an area to further focus on to enable more compliance with building codes. The informal sector, as mentioned previously, is very high, and so we have proposed a timeline for the participation of the informal sector and how to include it in these building policies. However, we have not been able to collect much information or consensus about what the strategy would be to overcome this challenge. So we would really appreciate your thoughts on that later on. But for now, the milestones that we've suggested are increased tools to enable simplified compliance, simply monitoring the extent of the informal sector, and with an aim to gradually include it more and more within standards. Then we have a couple of policies on labeling, so building labeling and labeling of building components to ensure designers and buyers have comprehensive information about the performance of the building or performance of building materials before using them or buying them. These types of policies can help drive up demand for more efficient products. Another set of key policies include the use of building passports, which is essentially a system by which to record and track information about a building. So this could include information, physical information about the building, about when it was built, what kinds of materials went into the building, but also include the systems that are in there, and also the energy performance over time, so energy bills, and eventually embodied carbon, and provide a way of systematically storing information to retain it with the building. Another one is the use of life cycle tools to enable increased use of life cycle analysis. So life cycle analysis should really consider all stages of the building's life cycle, and therefore reward the use of recycled materials, increased lifetime, provision for adaptation of the building, and other circular economy design principles. And we found that generally people found that data to perform these calculations in a robust manner is lacking or difficult to find, or not accurate, which is why data collection and robust calculation methodologies are some of the milestones included in the timeline here, because they are key to putting the framework in place to start making these analyses possible and more accurate and widespread. And here again, there was a data gap or information gap about how widespread life cycle analysis could really become. And finally, financial and non-financial incentives are also expected to grow to pull up the demand for high-performing buildings. Then now when we look at the technologies, these are the technology timelines, which list the building envelope technologies that will be key to delivering zero-emission efficient buildings. But of course, the strategy for the building envelope and the combination of technologies that are the most appropriate to the building, of course, will depend on the local climate and on the materials available. However, there are still some principles and some common themes that do apply. So, for example, even in warm climates, insulation will be beneficial on roofs and walls, which is why we have a timeline for the use of insulation becoming really quite widespread in roofs and walls in new buildings, and also a target for the building envelope. And the building envelope here is in terms of the overall thermal transfer value, which is a measure of the transfer of heat through the building fabric. And we found that there was a large divergence and uncertainty in being able to estimate typical values today in the regions when we spoke to people. So, so that is something that would be worth investigating a little bit more. Windows, improving the performance of windows is also key. So increasing the availability of double and triple glazed windows, as well as low E windows and solar control, solar performance glazing where they are appropriate. And where they are appropriate will depend on design and cost analysis, but where they are appropriate, they should be more widely available. So this is what these timelines represent here. Shading of windows is another technology, much more low cost and low technology solution to avoid cooling demand, and is often missing from modern building designs, despite it being an ancient and can be very low cost solution. It can be a much cheaper way of getting the same benefit as a low E or low solar heat gain coefficient window. So there was very strong consensus among respondents to the survey that external shading really would become widespread in the future. And then a couple more technologies for new building on the passive design side. So with reflective surface finishes are other ways of blocking out heat gain from the sun. So in warm climates with high solar radiation, reflective surface finishes on roofs and walls can be very beneficial. And these sorts of solutions will make it more likely that a passive cooling or natural ventilation strategy might be adequate and would not need an air conditioner. So we found that there was consensus that that passive cooling and natural ventilation is not currently optimized as much as it could be in residential and non-residential buildings. Therefore, one of the targets here is to really maximize the use of these solutions. Another one is daylighting. That's another passive design measure. So optimizing natural light through building design and through controls and through smart lighting. And this was an area where the consensus was that there would be improvement and more optimization of daylight, but it didn't seem that it would become particularly widespread in new buildings. And then the last one, which is also related to the other ones above, is the one about design tools. So these design tools include tools such as energy and thermal simulation software that can be used to demonstrate the cost benefit of different solutions and really optimize the design and choices of building materials and building features to ensure that design decisions can be taken to optimize the cost over the life cycle and not only optimized based on capital costs. So these tools becoming widespread will enable more people to be able to design a robust natural ventilation strategy, for example. Another example of tools would be BIM, or building information modeling, or 3D printing, prefabrication. These are all tools that can really radically optimize the design and construction process. So can have a big role in materials efficiency, but also design and construction efficiency. So that was new buildings. You'll have the chance in a moment to be able to make some questions. If you want to already send some questions through the chat, please do. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about resilience, because this was another area where we would appreciate your input on. So the definition that we've been using to talk about resilience is from the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, which defines resilience as the ability of a city or a building exposed to hazards to resist, absorb, accommodate to, and recover from the effects of a hazard in a timely and efficient manner. So this is where policies and design adaptation to existing buildings and design of new buildings could really improve the capacity of buildings to resist and adapt and recover from disasters. So we're talking about natural disasters, but also, of course, the risks associated with climate change. So the main risks in the Latin America region are flooding and sea level rise, but also warming, change in rainfall, drought, and flooding. So different types of adaptation technologies and policies will be needed. We have seen that several cities in several Latin American countries have already developed resilient strategies. We have a little bit more about them in the document itself. So these could provide great examples for other cities within the region. But integrated resilience planning and coordination across government is still a challenge. And so the key actions here are really using data and information to perform integrated urban planning and risk zoning, and also developing risk maps and integrated assessment plans, and assessing, mapping vulnerable populations to be able to then develop adaptation techniques to resist the particular hazard. So the policies that we have under resilience include risk mapping, resilience strategies, as I mentioned, but also resilience in building codes, as building codes could be a mechanism that could be leveraged, particularly for new buildings, as they could begin to incorporate resilience requirements or outline resilience strategies. But for that, coordination and integration will be necessary. There is also the challenge of existing buildings and finding a fair solution for settlements located in high-risk areas, so how to deal with relocation. Therefore, developing strategies to deal with these issues will become more and more important. And finally, we have data and monitoring, which will enable better risk mapping and the creation of more effective strategies, where the focus should start with developing early warning systems for the most vulnerable areas. So as I mentioned, we have some great examples from the region, including from the Climate Resilient Cities Initiative, which is acting in 7 Latin American countries, but also from several countries and cities across Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, and others. And you can read more about them in the document. So where we've highlighted where there is a data gap, that is really about a gap where we are lacking information about how to achieve these timelines and feedback on these timelines. Are these the right targets? Therefore, your feedback would be very much appreciated. And then lastly, on technologies for resilience, again, the same plea for feedback and comments to help develop these. But the technologies that that have been identified so far as delivering on the targets of improving resilience include, firstly, social networks. So social networks is the power of local communities to adapt and recover from hazards or disasters, and these really should be supported. And once the risks have been identified, appropriate adaptation tools to extreme weather should be identified, as well as strategies for their deployment. So these include strategies to adapt to extreme heat, for example, such as cool spaces, or to adapt to extreme wind or rain or other hazards. And strategies should be developed both for short-term and long-term response. And we have an item on stormwater management, which is using green infrastructure and vegetation to mitigate the damage caused by extreme rain and therefore increasing the coverage of permeable areas and reducing flooding risks and damage by rain, which is another item to be prioritized by cities with this particular risk. And finally, resilience to power outages is another aspect of resilience that cities and buildings should be planning for example, with increased non-fossil fuel backup power distribution systems. We also see in regions with water shortages, resilience to resilient water supply would be another item here. So we are looking to hear from you as to what systems have been identified in your jurisdictions as being key to increasing resilience. And so if you have some ideas, please do share your thoughts in the discussion, in the moderated discussion we are shortly getting to. So one last thing before we move on to that is just a little slide on our findings from the enablers chapter. So looking at what are the key actions within the training, capacity building, data collection, and financing areas. So for training, we found that many people were noting that, of course, more training is needed of practitioners and of professionals, but incorporating green buildings topics into core university curricula is seen as a very effective agent for change also. For data, it was noted that strong political will is really needed to prioritize the building sector and prioritize establishing baseline data targets and strategies to improve performance in the building sector, but also that capacity building and tools for the processing of this data are critical to actually make the collected data usable and useful. We also found that there was not so much consensus around what the actual data needs were, what areas were priority and what data was a priority. So this is also an area where where a strategy would be useful. And with institutional coordination, this was a theme that came up in across many of the different activities. So this is about vertical and horizontal integration within government, so across different levels of national, subnational, municipal government, but also across different disciplines, and making sure that policies are integrated where they affect each other, as they do so often with these types of policies that we're talking about. We also noted the potential of green building councils or equivalent green building communities of professionals and their important role to organize stakeholders and to advocate for change within their networks. And then finally, financing, another area where reliable data is often limited. Sharing of best practice was also highlighted as another key suggestion. And it was also noted that often, even when finance is available, the different rules or lack of tools and awareness mean that this finance actually isn't accessible, even though it is there and available. So I think now we are going to move on to our moderated discussion. So some of the questions that we have prepared will touch on things that I've mentioned in the presentation. But again, if you have questions related to anything specific here, please send them in the in the chat, and then we can get to them also. So we are using this platform, Mentimeter, to manage questions. So if you go in your browser to menti.com and use the code that's at the top of the screen, you'll be able to access the questions and access a box where you can type in your answer, and we will all see your answers show up on the screen here. So we have 3 questions that we might take a couple of minutes to consider. So the first one is about really hearing from you what are the common practices of nature-based solutions, local building designs, and local materials used to address climate conditions in your region, or used to that really will be promising in achieving the all of the actions that we've been mentioning. So we invite you to submit your answers here, noting which country you're responding from, please. And I'll talk you through the other 2 and then give you a few minutes to submit your answers. So question number 2 is about examples of resilience to climate vulnerability of buildings in your region. So what are the types of ways that buildings or cities are adapting to climate risks in your region to make them more resilient? Because we are really looking for more examples to include in our document. And then a third one is about the informal sector and how we might address this barrier that many of the construction would not actually fall under any regulatory framework, even if a building code did exist. So how do we ensure that any policies or any actions also reach the informal sector? So we'd really appreciate your thoughts on these questions. And if anybody would like to speak and voice their thoughts, then we'd be happy to give you the microphone if you put your hand up in the webinar box.
So it looks as though there's quite a few answers coming in for the first question, which are really great. And it seems that the focus here is a combination of solar gains, being able to control those to reduce heat gains through openings, such as shading along windows, and then also looking around how ventilation and making use of architecture that allows for cross flow can help to ensure the reduced use of air conditioning in these buildings. I also see that more thermally heavy materials such as clay and adobe likely being used in brick and straw combinations being used in areas where there's both an availability of the material, presumably, and also where the heat allows for that.
Yeah, thank you for all of these contributions. Look at
So we can see that some of the questions coming in around resilient development as well. Being able to make use of techniques that reduce the risk of land movement, as pointed out with slope stabilization. And I believe there's another in around flooding risks and drainage. Although these continue to be around, which is great, the use of materials and nature-based solutions available. Vegetation and shading through natural trees and vegetation, or shading along roofs, can also help to reduce the heat gain through materials. These are all looking very good. So looking through here, you can see that issues around flooding and some of the construction practices in particular might be key concerns. In this region, particularly in the northern part of the region where there are risk of tropical storm activities, I suppose there's a variety of vulnerabilities that buildings will face in terms of rain and flood risk, but presumably also high wind, in addition to heat. So the idea of being able to map out where flood risk areas exist, and this refers also to the previous question where someone had put in slope stabilization, building in floodplain areas and slope typically associated with either new developments going into agricultural lands that had historically otherwise not been affected by this in the sense of hard materials increasing the flood risk, but also then informal developments that are making use of marginal land area that has historically been deemed less usable. An interesting point about the hotel sector in Mexico in terms of being able to make use of presumably the heavy resources requirements of hotels in terms of water and energy for cooling primarily, suspect. interesting to note that there's examples here in Mexico that are focusing on reducing that.
Thank you also for the point about the reset certification that somebody posted about in the chat, and it's also mentioned here. But it's a certification system specifically designed for the tropics, which is very valuable to consider specific climate risks of the area. Go to
So here, if people have a moment to add in some thoughts around how to ensure that these roadmaps are useful here, particularly around the informal sector, and what more could be said or promoted in terms of where the roadmaps could provide some information and assistance. At the moment, the examples coming back are around providing localized strategies or support, whether that through programs that are focused in particular typologies or areas, perhaps. The point about ensuring that there are a variety of alliances across those who might work within the building sector in a particular country or across a region, and on the regulation and certification side.
Would anybody, I see there are no hands raised, but would anybody like to say something about any of the 3 questions that we've seen? You can either let us know in the chat box or using the raised hand function. Thank you very much for all of these examples. It doesn't look like anybody would particularly like to come and speak on the microphone about them, in which case I'd suggest to move on to the next series of questions, which are about the next steps. So how do you think that these documents could best be used to create impact in your region? So from what could we do next with these documents, or how do you think they would most be useful in impacting at a regional or country or subnational level? We'd really like to hear your thoughts about that. I'll run through them all and then we'll give you a few minutes. So which parts of or aspects of the documents do you think are the most interesting or useful to disseminate? So between the timelines, the examples, and the key actions. And finally, which are the communication channels that will create most visibility for this document? So a few people have already started answering. We'll give a few more minutes. So we're seeing lots of workshops and seminars aligning the roadmaps to national policies where possible. And so I presume that this is the regional, the Latin America regional roadmap. So can we interpret that the Latin America roadmap is already directly useful to aligning some of the national policies? So by that I mean the regional perspective is enabling that. Or do you think there is a necessity to create national versions of these documents first?
Something also to consider is how existing strategies that focus on improving or addressing building performance could be helpful in these roadmaps, or vice versa, how the roadmaps could help inform some of the dialogue that's already ongoing with strategies for improving the building stock and thinking about perhaps how existing policies for meeting national determined contributions, NDCs, for buildings, which are typically a sizable source of emissions for Latin American countries, depending on the location and region. Good point about translation.
Yeah, and we're happy to be able to say that it will be translated into Spanish. Okay, thank you for these inputs. So it seems so far that the key actions are really the most interesting and useful part of these documents, followed by the regional examples and the timelines, and not so much the regional introductions. It is interesting for us to note. And then finally, the communication channels that will create the most visibility for this document, or for the parts of the document that would be the most interesting to disseminate. Local events and workshops, yeah, has been mentioned many times. Government channels, industry associations, social media. Okay. Would anybody like to say anything or ask a question or make any comments before we close, because we're reaching the end of our webinar time. But I just would like to give the opportunity one more time to anybody who would like to. Okay, so with that, I will let you know that we will be sharing the presentation and the results from these Menti questions. So, but we will leave them open until the end of the day. So if you would like to think about it a little bit more, would like to provide any additional insights, we are extremely grateful for this kind of feedback and this kind of this level of information, and we will definitely use it to enrich the documents. So please do feel free to keep add anything you might like to, and then we will circulate them around to everybody who has participated here today. So with that, we just have one last slide on the next steps. And so we are currently in a phase where we are collecting feedback and comments on the current versions of the documents that are in the link that you have. And we are collecting comments until next Monday. So we really do appreciate your feedback and your suggestions, suggestions of missing information, or anything that you think could be useful to us. We've sent you a review sheet to help guide your review with some of the key questions that we would be interested in, and so we really do invite you to have one last look at these documents before we finalize them. We'll finalize this version of them by March 2020. So they'll be launched in March and downloadable as PDFs on the IEA and Global ABC websites in a first instance, and we're discussing ways of making sure that we keep using the content and keep sharing the content, perhaps through more interactive channels like an interactive website rather than a PDF. So, and then the other item is that we hope to continue working on these roadmaps, and the next step may be informing national roadmaps, and we really do hope that these can provide a framework for national, local action on buildings. And if you see any synergies with what you may be working on and what we've been doing with the roadmaps, please do get in touch so that we can see if we can how we can collaborate further. So once again, thank you so much for all of your contributions and your time. Our contact information is here, and as I said, we will be sending around the presentation, the Menti results, and the link one more time to the documents for review. So many thanks. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.